The room hummed with polished laughter and the clinking of glasses when I heard her voice behind me, sharp as memory. "Still single, Corinne? Poor you. Look at my husband, rich and loyal." I turned slowly, my face steady, though my pulse jumped. "You might want to meet mine, too." The air stilled. Her smirk flickered for the briefest second before I let my gaze drift away, pretending it was nothing. 10 years earlier, Beatrix and I had shared a room barely bigger than a storage closet, two broke girls with cheap instant coffee and dreams too large for our rent. We worked double shifts at the cafe, our shoes always sticky with spilled syrup, whispering about the day we'd open a place of our own. When the pipes froze one winter and I came down with the flu, she walked through snow at midnight just to bring me soup from the 24-hour diner. I thought that was love in its purest form, the kind you never lose. We celebrated small victories together, the day she landed her first marketing job, the day I got promoted to manager. We were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences, planning each other's futures. She'd grin and say, "You and me, Corinne, against the world," and I'd answer, "Always." I meant it. When I met Leland, she was there too, glowing with pride, teasing me about how nervous I was. She helped him pick the ring, planned the proposal, toasted us that night like a sister. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have both of them, him for love, her for loyalty. I didn't know then that one would steal the other, that my perfect picture was already cracking beneath the frame. Looking at her now, I finally understood how silence can taste like betrayal. I met Leland at a community fundraiser the cafe sponsored, one of those small-town events with string lights and cheap wine. He bought a bag of my beans and stayed to talk about the future, about how people like us could build something from nothing. He wasn't flashy, just steady, with that banker's patience that made me feel safe. When he said, "You have vision, Corinne," I laughed, not knowing he'd later use that same voice to break me. Beatrix met him the next week when he'd dropped by for coffee, and she was all charm and sparkle, teasing me that he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. She helped him pick the ring, whispering that he wanted it to be perfect. I didn't think twice when she offered to plan parts of the proposal. She'd always been the organizer, the one with taste. When he got down on one knee beside the lake, she was the first person I called. She screamed through the phone, crying, "He's the one, Corinne! You did it!" That night, she showed up with a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses, insisting she'd toast the beginning of my forever. We toasted until the bubbles turned flat, laughing about how life had finally gotten it right. I remember her wiping tears and saying, "You deserve this." I believed her. The next weeks blurred with flower samples and deposit slips. My evenings smelled like ink and wedding envelopes, my hands stained from writing names that no longer mattered. Beatrix was always nearby, fixing my hair, checking catering menus, texting Leland like she was my second shadow. I thought it was friendship, the kind that fills the air so thick you can't see betrayal forming through it. The night it all shattered, rain hammered the windows while I waited for Leland to come home. I'd kept dinner warm, humming, addressing invitations with that stupid excitement that blinds you before disaster. When the key finally turned, his silence entered first. He looked pale, drenched, like guilt had soaked through his suit. "We need to talk," he said, and my stomach sank, already knowing the words that would follow. "It's Beatrix," he whispered, eyes darting away. "I think I'm in love with her." For a moment, the world went still, like someone had cut the sound from my life. I asked quietly, "My maid of honor?" He nodded, and the sound that escaped me wasn't a cry, it was a laugh so sharp it hurt. I walked past him, my voice steady even as my hands shook. "How long?" He stared at the floor. "A few months, after the engagement party." Each word landed like a stone. "So while she picked my dress, while she stood beside me holding champagne, you were with her?" He didn't answer, and that silence became my closure. I took off the ring she'd helped him choose and placed it in his palm. "Get your things and go," I said. He tried to speak, but I was already turning away.
The door closed, and the only sound left was the rain beating against glass and the heartbeat in my throat. I sat on the floor among the invitations, staring at a future printed in ink that no longer existed. Somewhere out there, they were together, and here I was finally alone with the truth. The first morning after he left, the apartment felt hollow, like the sound had been scraped out of it. I packed everything that smelled like them, their wine glasses, the framed photo from the cafe party, even the mugs she'd given me. I moved into a one-bedroom above an auto shop where the hum of engines replaced conversation. When people asked how I was doing, I said, fine, and poured the lie into a paper cup. Work became the only noise I could stand. I took every shift the cafe offered, wiping counters until my hands cracked. I stopped wearing the ring and started learning to roast beans, staying late after close just to feel the heat and smoke. The owner caught me one night and said, "You've got a touch for this." And for the first time in months, I felt something close to pride. By spring, I'd quit my job and rented a small space behind a dentist office that reeked of antiseptic and hope. I painted the walls the color of espresso and called it Clark Roastery. My first roaster was secondhand, the kind that coughed when you turned it on, but I treated it like it was worth a fortune. When the first bag sold, I told myself, this is how you rebuild, with burnt fingers and bitter grounds. Marisol came along that summer, a kid who'd wandered in asking for part-time work. She stayed because she said the place smelled like a fresh start. I told her if bitterness had a scent, it'd be over-roasted beans. She laughed and stayed anyway, saying she liked the honesty. Together, we learned how to package, price, and pretend we knew what we were doing. I stopped counting the years since the betrayal. I counted sales instead. Some nights after closing, I'd sit with Marisol at the counter, both of us drinking coffee gone cold. She'd ask, "Do you ever think about them?" And I'd shrug, only when the silence gets too loud. It wasn't entirely true, but it made her smile, and that was enough. The days blurred into the rhythm of grind and steam. I'd wake at dawn, unlock the front door, and watch the first lights spill across the stainless machines like forgiveness. There was a strange comfort in the repetition, the smell of roasted beans replacing perfume and regret. One afternoon, a local blogger stopped by and wrote about a woman who turned heartbreak into a coffee empire, and the next week we had lines out the door. With each new customer, I built another layer of armor. I spoke at small business fairs, told young women about failing forward, about how the world doesn't owe you closure, you roast your own. When Marisol joked, "You're turning into a legend, Corinne," I smiled and said, "Legends are just survivors who didn't quit," and somehow it stopped feeling like a joke.
By the 5th year, Clark Roastery had 3 locations and a 4th on the way. The cafe that once smelled like loss now smelled like success and fresh pastry. I'd walk past the front windows and watch people sip what I'd built from nothing. Sometimes I'd see couples holding hands, and instead of envy, I felt a quiet pride. They reminded me that love could exist again, just not the same kind. Late one night, I stood alone in the roasting room, the hum of the machines steady as a heartbeat. The last batch finished with a hiss, and I whispered, "They took my trust, but not my fire." I realized then that revenge wasn't about watching them fall, it was about watching myself rise. The bitterness had finally turned sweet, and the cup was mine again. By the time Clark Roastery opened its 4th location, success felt like routine, not triumph. My days moved in cycles of meetings, deliveries, and quiet gratitude I couldn't quite feel. People called me self-made, as if that erased what came before. Sometimes when the shop was empty, I'd catch my reflection in the glass and whisper, "You made it," just to hear how hollow it sounded. The interviews came next. Local radio, business magazines, even a feature titled Seattle's Coffee Queen. I smiled for photos, holding a cup that carried my name, but the applause never sank in. Marisol noticed before anyone else. "You're building an empire, Corinne," she said one night, wiping down the counter. "So why do you still look like you're waiting for something?" I laughed and said, "Maybe because I am." And that was when Garrett entered my orbit.
a quiet engineer who stopped by every morning, tinkering with his laptop while sipping espresso. He asked about the roasting process, then offered to design a prototype for a smarter coffee machine. We talked business first, but the conversation stretched until closing. One night when he said, "Do you ever forgive them?" I answered, "No, I just stopped needing to." He nodded like he understood more than I'd said. Months passed and his presence became part of the rhythm, his calm balancing my restlessness. When he proposed, it wasn't fireworks, just a steady promise over takeout boxes and laughter. We married quietly at City Hall. No flowers, no audience, just peace. For a while, I believed that was the ending, that love found in stillness could overwrite the chaos that came before. The envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday, thick paper embossed with gold, Beverage Innovators Summit, invitation only. I traced the lettering and felt something twist beneath my ribs. Garrett saw my hesitation and said, "You should go, you've earned it." I smiled, but the name at the bottom caught my eye. Pierce and Miller Beverage Group, keynote sponsors. I stared at it for a long time before answering, "Maybe it's time I did." The taste in my mouth was familiar bitterness, strong and slow, the kind that lingers even after you think it's gone. The resort sat against the lake like a secret, glass walls reflecting snow and money. I arrived with Garrett 2 days after the opening reception, and everything about the place reeked of polished ambition. Inside the conference hall, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 10 years, bright, performative, and still too loud for the room. "Corinne, is that really you?" she said, already halfway into my space. I turned and saw Beatrix with Leland beside her, his smile tight, his hands folded like he was praying for escape. "It's been ages," she said, eyes running over my tailored suit, my badge, the company name beneath it. "You look successful." I smiled. "And you look well." Her laugh was the same brittle glass I remembered. "Life's been good to us. Leland's managing corporate accounts now, and I've been running campaigns all over the country." I nodded, letting her talk. She always mistook silence for admiration.
At lunch the next day, she appeared again, her tone dipped in sweetness. "I read about your coffee line," she said, adjusting the diamond on her finger. "So inspiring. You must work non-stop, though I can't imagine having time for that and a family." I smiled and took a sip of water. "You imagine, right?" She leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. "Still single, huh? Poor you, all that success and no one to share it with. Look at my husband, rich and loyal." "I am." The words should have stung, but they rolled off me like steam. I let the pause stretch, watching the flicker of victory in her eyes. "You might want to meet mine, too," I said, my voice even. Her smirk froze, the color draining as if she'd swallowed something bitter. Leland looked up sharply, his napkin slipping from his lap. I stood, pretending to check my phone. He should be here any minute. The air between us tightened, her composure cracking just enough to show panic. I walked toward the lobby, hearing their whispers behind me. Garrett arrived minutes later, a quiet presence in a room that worshipped loud success. People turned to greet him, recognizing the founder of Holtz Tech, the name printed on half the machines in the hospitality industry. When he spotted me, his smile reached his eyes. "Everything okay, love?" he asked, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Perfect," I said, turning back to find Beatrix staring like she'd seen a ghost. I could almost feel the tremor in her voice when she said, "Garrett Holloway? That's your husband?" I smiled. "That's right." He extended a hand toward Leland. "Always nice to meet Corinne's old friends," he said warmly. Leland muttered something that sounded like congratulations, his handshake limp. Beatrix's lips twitched into a painful smile. "We've heard of your company. Impressive work." Garrett nodded. "Corinne's the impressive one. I just followed her lead." His hand slipped around my waist, and for the first time in years, the gesture didn't feel like armor. It felt like home. She tried to recover, rambling about projects and sponsorships, but every word fell flat. "You two must be quite the power couple," she said finally, her voice brittle. I shrugged. We don't think in titles, we just build things that last. Leland shifted beside her, looking anywhere but at me. We should catch up later, she said, forcing a laugh that sounded too thin. Maybe share ideas. I met her gaze and said, ideas only work when they're original. And as they walked away, Garrett leaned close. That was the famous Beatrix? I nodded, watching her stumble slightly in heels too high for humility. And that was the man she thought was worth betraying me for. He raised an eyebrow. Looks like he aged worse than the coffee at a motel. I laughed quietly. Poetic justice always runs late, but it never misses a flight. Later that evening at the networking dinner, the hum of conversation filled the ballroom, but their laughter was gone. I caught them standing by the bar, tense and separate, the space between them louder than their words. When Beatrix's eyes met mine across the room, I lifted my glass slightly in a silent toast. She looked away first. As we left, Garrett said, "You handled that better than I would have." I smiled. They built their happiness on stolen ground. I just had to show them the cracks. He squeezed my hand. You know, Corinne, you didn't need revenge. I looked toward the lake, where the water mirrored the lights. No, I said softly. I just needed proof that I'd outgrown it. In the reflection, the woman who once cried over betrayal was gone. All that remained was the one who'd learned to brew strength out of ruin. That night, the lake shimmered with quiet light, and Garrett and I stood on the terrace, watching the reflections move like breathing. He handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You look peaceful." I smiled, feeling the truth settle for the first time. Maybe because I finally am. He nodded. They'll have to live with what they built. You, on the other hand, built something real. I looked toward the conference hall where the laughter had faded hours ago. Somewhere behind those glass walls, Beatrix and Leland were packing their illusions into silence. The thought didn't bring satisfaction, only closure. You don't owe them forgiveness, Garrett said gently. Forgiveness isn't the point, I replied. Letting go is. The words left my mouth and felt lighter than I expected. Back in our suite, I sat by the window while the night folded over the lake. The hum of the city below felt like applause I no longer needed. I whispered, "They brewed my downfall, but I turned it into strength." Garrett smiled without looking up. "That's how you make the best coffee. Under pressure." I laughed softly, tracing the rim of my mug, realizing how far I'd come from the woman who once measured worth in someone else's promise. As dawn stretched across the mountains, I felt the final thread of bitterness dissolve. Success had been the armor, but peace was the victory. "Do you ever think life balances itself?" Garrett asked. I nodded. It always does. You just have to stay long enough to see it happen. When we left the resort, the air felt new, clean, and unburdened. The past had finished its story, and for the first time, the ending was mine. Thank you for staying until the end of my story. If you've ever been betrayed and had to rebuild from the ground up, I hope this reminded you that strength grows in silence. Please like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and comment #1 so I know you're here.